My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. We have a very special guest today, but before we get into our conversation with him, I wanted to point something out. I am releasing this podcast on April 9th, 2026, 10 years ago today, on April 9th, 2016, during the before times, the first episode of the Chinese Literature Podcast dropped. Rob and I released two podcasts on that same day, one on Jiang Xingge and his pearl sewn shirt, one on Liu's story called Tower for the Summer Heat. I'm not sure why we did two episodes at once. Maybe it was because we thought having a backlog made us look serious or something. I that's just my guess. Since then, the podcast has lasted a whole decade. We've done about 250 episodes and we are still going. I thought about doing a big to-do for the 10th anniversary, looking at clips and doing other stuff, but I decided against it because honestly, who cares? If y'all want to go back and look at the older episodes, they are there for you. Go to the podcast website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. But right now, I think concentrating on the next 10 years is the way to go. With all that said, let's get to today's guest, the first guest in the next decade of the Chinese Literature Podcast, Professor Morris Rossabi. He's a scholar who helped us rethink the contributions of the Mongols to the modern world. He wrote the first good biography of Kublai Khan in English, really the first biography in any language, drawing off sources from all of the various languages discussing this world-changing figure. Beyond just Mongols and Kublai Khan, he helped us rethink what China's relationship with the non-Chinese world was like, whereas before I think most scholars in China and outside of China would have accepted the notions in Chinese narratives that these non-Chinese people were just barbarians. We didn't really need to pay that close of attention to them. They were just always disturbing China and what was happening inside China. Professor Rossabi showed us that we should look at sources from these non-Chinese neighbors, not necessarily completely reject Chinese notions, but modify them, taking into account the sources and perspectives of the Mongols and other groups interacting with the Chinese. Professor Rossabi is still a professor. He's still teaching. He's a distinguished professor at the City University of New York, and he also teaches some at Columbia University. Professor Rossabi, thank you so much for coming on.
I'm delighted to be here. I always enjoy talking about the Mongols and about Kublai Khan, so it's a pleasure to be here with you.
You wrote one of the first really good English language biographies of Kublai Khan. There were some biographies in Chinese, but they were lacking in some things, and there were some biographies from drawing on Middle Eastern sources. Can you tell me about that biography that you wrote that is still being read today?
I came across it in the 1970s that no one had written a biography of Kublai Khan that included a variety of different sources, not just Chinese or not just Persian, and very few Mongol sources, as it turns out, contemporaneous ones. So I wanted to really combine those and provide as much of a vivid portrait as I possibly could, because I viewed him as a major transitional figure in nomadic pastoral history. He moved from someone who was just involved in conquest to somebody who tried to rule a great civilization, a foreign civilization, the Chinese. And so that prompted me to work on it. And some of the biographies were not based on primary sources, I found. And so I was eager to get back to the original and read as much as possible of the original primary sources so that I could get a real feeling for Kublai.
Kublai Khan, you mentioned he's this major transitional figure in the transition from sort of steppe-oriented culture to settled culture when he's ruling China. But he's one of the most important figures of that millennium. Can you tell me why he's important, who he is, and why he's important for just people who have heard his name but don't really know who he is?
He was descended from Genghis Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, that is a third generation, and he was brought up for the most part in China. By the time he was an adult, the Mongols had taken over China, and his mother, who was a rather imposing woman, had land that was given to her in northern China, and so he grew up there pretty much. He learned to speak Chinese which is different from obviously most Mongols of that era. And so he identified with the Chinese more than did most of the Mongols. And so he basically tried in a variety of ways to bring Chinese civilization into ruling the people that he had conquered in northern China and then eventually at the southern Chinese. He was the one that kind of unified China. Before that time, the China was divided up between a north and a south for at least 100 years. And so, again, he's quite important in militarily and then in terms of administrative structure, bringing China under the control of a larger entity, larger unit.
So I want to ask some questions about Chinese identity, but before we get to that, so he was born in northern China at a time when the Southern Song still
Still
existed.
existed.
Okay, and he's the one who destroys the Southern Song in 1279.
In 1279, yes. Kublai was responsible for conquering, invading, and then conquering the Southern Sung dynasty and destroying the last evidence of a Chinese dynasty for another 100 years. He occupied the southern part of China, which was actually the most fertile and prosperous part of China. And so there was a big effort on his part. I don't like to stress his military campaigns because he wasn't involved so much, unlike Genghis Khan, who took part, his grandfather took part in many of the military campaigns. Kublai was not on the battlefield for the most part. And I think he did that deliberately because he wanted to emphasize the civilian and administrative aspects of Mongol rule.
Is that him drawing on Chinese precedent? Because generally, it's fairly rare for Chinese emperors to go onto the battlefield, and there is that distinction between Wen and Wu, between kind of the
That's right.
literary and
And
the martial.
yeah, he fit in very well with that Chinese practice of dividing really the military from the civilian and emphasize as much as possible civilian domination over the military rather than the other way around, as had been the case with many Mongols. So he really deviated from the typical Mongol image of a warrior. Portraits of him are basically never on a battlefield, and that was the image that he was trying to convey to the population. None of them are of him in any sort of military costume or anything of the sort.
You've mentioned that he was the grandson of Genghis Khan. Oftentimes, so Chinggis or Genghis, they're the same person. It's just Chinggis reflects the Mongol pronunciation. Is that correct?
That's right. Chinggis is the Mongolian pronunciation, not Genghis. That's a later emendation by Persians who referred to him as Genghis rather than as Chinggis, the original Mongol name.
Okay, I didn't realize that came from Persia.
Yeah, yeah. One of the major sources about Genghis Khan is in Persian and is an account of his campaigns in Central Asia and a general. It's translated the Persian account as the history of the world conqueror. So it's a little bit hyperbolic.
Just a little.
He's a world conqueror, and in fact, the image of Genghis as a world conqueror is somewhat misleading. Most of the conquests that were made by the Mongols were after his death, so it's very different. Kublai was responsible for incorporating a large territory and a major territory in southern China. So, in a sense, he was responsible for expanding the Mongol territories more so than his grandfather.
So his grandfather, Chinggis, leads these armies. He creates a small polity in what's now modern day Mongolia. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Well,
right. One of Genghis's most important accomplishments was bringing about unity of the Mongols. Not so much his conquests, but bringing about a unified force. The Mongols, until the time of Genghis, were warring amongst each other. And in fact, he had to overcome a number of chieftains and khans and so on during his own lifetime. And it was only in his, I guess, in his mid 40s that he became the leader of all of the Mongols, and therefore could undertake the conquests for which he's known.
Chinggis grew up in a very hard world. Could you tell us just a little bit about his upbringing and how he kind of creates that unity?
Sure, Genghis. One of the first things we know about him is he was taken by his father when he was about 8 or 9 to his the wife that had been chosen for him, and he was supposed to live with that family until the marriage was completed. But on the way back, the father was murdered, and so Genghis was brought back to his native family, and the mother played a very important role in trying to preserve her sons. There's lots of stories about her living on nuts and berries, and and instructing Genghis and the other brothers that the only way they could get ahead was through blood brotherhoods, was through uniting with other people. And blood brotherhood is a term called Anda in Mongolian, Anda. And that was the beginning of Genghis. He established brotherhoods with people who had larger military forces, larger access to land and property and animals. Then he kept on developing these Andas and became the head of the whole Mongol people. In some cases, it was he had to fight his way to the top. He defeated a number of figures who had been Andas with him and resented his growing authority and power. But that was the way he really succeeded and became. Genghis is actually a title. He was known as his real name was Temujin, and he was given the title Genghis Khan when he was in his 40s as an element of his success in bringing about unity of the Mongols.
This idea of blood brotherhood is really important in Chinese literature. Was he influenced by that, or was that a kind
No,
of
it came directly from the concept of Andas came directly from the history of the Mongols. I don't think there was any direct connection with the Chinese concept. They had the same idea or the same concept, basically.
so Mongols come out of Mongolia? I guess that almost seems tautological, but the place we call Mongolia was previously the home of lots of different steppe groups. Like previously, it had been dominated by Turks. The Uyghur Empire there and collapses in 840. Um, Mongol, is it related to, is it, I know it's not a Turkic language, but how, I have heard some folks suggest that it is somehow distantly related to Turkic, situate like the kind of language and culture in that Central Asian steppe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Mongolian is related to the Turkic languages. It's part of a group called the Uralic Altaic group of languages, referring to two mountain ranges, the Urals that divide now Eastern Russia from Western Russia, and the Altai Mountains, which are in the northern part of Mongolia. So there are a number of languages that have been lumped together in that group because of certain characteristics in the grammar, syntax, and those include, interestingly enough, Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and some people believe Korean and Japanese ought to be included in that group. So it's a mixed kind of language grouping, but they do have certain similarities in common.
So we've talked a little bit about Chinggis, and we had talked previously about Kublai. So Chinggis sort of starts this conquest, and it kind of takes off. You mentioned that most of the conquest of the Mongols didn't happen until after Chinggis died. His son Ogadai,
Right.
am I pronouncing Ogadai, leads lots of conquest, and Kublai was not actually tipped to be very important. He was actually kind of minor royalty. Is that right?
That's correct. One of the defaults of the Mongols was that they did not have a regular system of succession, and that plagued them from earliest days on. The only successor who didn't go through a terrible war or conflict of some sort was Chinggis's own son, Ögedei, and it took 2 years after Chinggis's death for him to be chosen as the new Khan. There was no system like ultimogeniture that took hold. That is, the youngest son being the successor to the father, or primogeniture, the oldest son being the successor. What happened was a conference of the top Mongol nobles would meet, and they would choose the successor based on supposedly on merit. It had to be somebody directly descended from Genghis, but that could be a variety of different people. And the problem that arose was different nobles had different candidates. And so after the initial successful transition under Ögedei, there would be conflicts. Even Kublai, when he became emperor of China, had to struggle with his youngest brother. A 4 year civil war between Kublai and his youngest brother because there was no real pattern of succession.
Is his younger brother, is that Chagatai?
No, his younger brother was Arich Burqa,
Okay,
uh,
okay.
and he. There is a kind of, it wasn't just a struggle between two brothers; it was two conceptions of the empire. Kublai felt that they had to accommodate to certain Chinese practices and institutions and adopt them if they were going to rule a China that had 50, 75 million, probably closer to 75 million people. While Arich Boka thought that was polluting the traditional Mongol civilization and wanted a return to a situation in which the Mongol values were predominant and no Chinese influence. And that's what made Kublai so important, that he was able to achieve a blend and become somewhat more like the Chinese in order to rule the Chinese, which he did fairly successfully for 34 years. The Aryabhata represented an entirely different strand. Even though he was defeated, that continued. There were some who wanted to reassert Mongolian values, Mongolian beliefs, and resented the influence of Chinese advisors, Chinese counselors who played a role in the government.
I mean, I'm thinking of other debates that China has had under the Qing Empire, which the Qing is, of course, Manchu. They had similar debates about how to maintain Manchu identity in the face of this vastly outnumbering Han Chinese population. So it's interesting to hear that these debates kind of get recycled.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There was certainly an attempt to maintain Mongol identity during the Mongol reign in China. And they were successful because when they were forced out of China, they returned to Mongolia and restored the Mongol way of life based on pastoral identity rather than accepting the Chinese system. Um, there was a tremendous effort to do that. And what they did basically under Kublai was to establish a four-class system, and the Mongols being the top class, then second class, other non-Chinese who would help them, Muslims, other people from North Asia who were not Chinese and who served the Mongols. Then the northern Chinese is the third class, and finally the southern Chinese. So there was that class system that was meant to protect Mongol identity that the Mongols developed. And I guess they were more successful than the Manchus in later period. The Manchus, are relatively isolated now. There are very few of them left, or have Manchu identity is not as secure as Mongol identity is at the present time.
You mentioned there was this four class system. So Kublai establishes that class system?
Yes, his advisors and in he did that. Yeah.
When I think of today, China and Chinese ethnicity, the division between North and South, although it exists and people do talk about it, it's always struck me as strange to have Hanren. So the third category is Hanren, right? The fourth category is Nanren, the Southern Chinese. Why divisions along those lines? Why not just have a single Hanren category?
Han identity. Why not have a single Chinese identity? In large part because the Southern Chinese resisted Mongol rule much more so than did the Northern Chinese, and the Northern Chinese had experiences with the Mongols. They were the ones that dealt with the Mongols throughout. They were close to the Mongols. They had traded with the Mongols, and so there wasn't as much of an hostility towards Mongol rule as it would be in the South. In the South, there were loyalists who continued to challenge the Mongols for at least one, if not more generations. And so the Mongols felt that they couldn't trust the Southern Chinese as much as they could the Northern Chinese, and that's why that kind of division occurred.
So would it be fair to say it's kind of political ethnic, like where the intersection of those two categories?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what it was. Political, the fear of being facing a disloyal constituency in the South, and that pretty much continued. A lot of the Northern Chinese were willing to work with the Mongols and serve the Mongols in government and other ways. Uh, the typical Southern Chinese were less willing to do so. And probably one of the most famous of these loyalists was regarded still as an important figure in China, was someone from the South who refused repeated efforts to be recruited into Kublai Khan's government.
What was his name, that loyalist?
Wen Tianxiang
Wen Tianxiang.
was
Okay,
it?
was he was a poet who was captured in the Southern Song when in 1275, I guess, when Hangzhou was
That's
captured,
right.
right?
That's
Okay,
right.
okay. I've translated some of his poetry, so the
Yeah,
name
and
familiar.
and he's an interesting character, but he was then imprisoned and so on, and had a difficult time because of perceived disloyalty.
Since we're talking about this question of Mongol versus Han, I have read in several sources that Genghis Khan, when he conquered China, he considered removing through some sort of ethnic cleansing method most ethnically Han Chinese folks from northern China and just turning it into pasture land. Is that true?
He was advised to do that, he was counseled to do that by some of the Mongol traditionalists, people
Mm.
allied with his younger brother. And he adhered to his mother's idea. His mother was quite an imposing figure, and she had trained the all four of her sons to become rulers of different parts of the Mongol Empire. One of them became the head of the Middle Eastern part, Persia and the Middle East. One of them became head of China, and another one, the oldest one, was the one who was succeeded in moving the Khanate from Ughday's line, the line of Genghis' son, to their line, the Kublai, if you want to call it the Kublai line. And so she thought that the way to do it was to identify more with the local population and not to exploit them. And that meant, in terms of the economy, promoting agriculture, not focusing on turning the land over into what the Mongols were used to, that is, a pastoral existence. And so there was great pressure on Kublai on the part of traditionalists, to do just that, to move from agriculture in North China to a kind of pastoral economy.
If he had followed the path of those traditionalists, would he have killed the northern Chinese folks or would he have just moved them south?
It would have been the North. Yeah, it would have turned the North over to the pastoral peoples, but it didn't occur. And his mother, Sorkhaftani Beki, a mouthful, was instrumental in that. She played a role in pushing pushing Kublai and his brothers into accepting the idea that peasants ought to be helped rather than undercut.
And his mother was a Nestorian Christian, is that right?
That's right. She was Nestorian Christianity had been banned in Europe because of the difference between ordinary Christianity and Nestorian Christians had fled to the Middle East around the fifth, sixth centuries A.D. And some of them became important in trade, and so they were involved in the Silk Road trade from the Middle East all the way to China. They reached China around the 8th century AD, and they did not find a particularly strong constituency in China. The Chinese already had a number of religions: Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and they found the idea of having one sole religion, which the Nestorians demanded, would have undercut the other religions. So the Nestorians had greater success in the pastoral areas, particularly among women. They appealed to women and were successful in those appeals. One of them was Kublai's mother. Another was Kublai's daughter-in-law, who played a very important role in Persia in promoting Nestorianism. The difference between the mother, Kublai's mother, and the others was that she maintained that even though she was an historian, she would tolerate all of the other religions. It was important to be tolerant of all the foreign religions if you were going to rule China. And so she made a big point of supporting Buddhist monasteries, of providing funds for an Islamic madrasa, a theological institution for Muslims, and not just Nestorianism. And that helped in terms of ruling China. That idea was transmitted to Kublai, and he did the same thing. Supported Buddhism, particularly a Tibetan form of Buddhism that arrived in China during that time. But he also made a point of supporting Islam, supporting Confucianism to an extent. The only philosophy that suffered was Taoism, because the Buddhists and the Taoists became involved in a major conflict. They were posing problems and causing instability. And Kublai in 1281 sided with the Buddhists. And so a number of Taoist monasteries were turned over to the Buddhists. A number of Taoist monks were defrocked and so on. But that was the only real religious purge. They were very tolerant under Kublai.
You use this word tolerant, and one of the things that the Mongols have become known for is the fact that they created this multi-confessional, multi-ethnic state 700, 800 years ago in a way that we're still, we have this ideal in the US and in other parts of the West, maybe less so in China, though even there I think it's an idea that's discussed. How was Kublai and the other parts of the Mongol Empire, how were they able to create this, and what role did other ethnic groups play? I mean, you've talked about Muslims. I mean, we haven't mentioned the Uyghurs, but the Uyghurs were also a very important part of the empire.
They, the Mongols were very tolerant of a variety of different peoples and were eager to get skills from a variety of different peoples. The Uyghurs were the first to whom they appealed. Uyghurs had built one of the first cities in the pastoral domains. They were basically pastoral people, and pastoral people move around. But they built a capital city. They had a written language, and that written language was the basis of the Mongolian written script. So they played a very important role as advisors, counselors, and so on. The Muslims who were brought in from Central Asia and Persia were brought in as financial administrators and were often involved in setting up budgets, collecting taxes, and providing the revenue that the Mongols needed. Muslims also had made a quantum leap forward in the Middle East in astronomy and in medicine. And so Muslim astronomers and physicians were imported into China by Kublai. They set up observatories. They brought with them astronomical instruments. A number of Persian texts on medicine were translated into Chinese during this time. So they used as much as possible the abilities and skills and knowledge of a wide variety of people to rule China. And so there was a multi-ethnic component to Mongol rule that, to a certain extent, was curtailed when the Mongols withdrew and native Chinese dynasty took power. There was more growing hostility towards Muslims, growing hostility towards other ethnic groups. But the 100 years in which they were in charge in China was a period of real multi-ethnicity.
Why do you think the Mongols were so receptive to I'll just call it multiculturalism, but I don't know if that's the right term. And why do you think the Han Chinese, when the Ming kicks out the Mongols, why were they so going back to maybe, is it fair to call it nationalism or xenophobia? I don't know the right way to describe it.
Well, the Ming dynasty that took power after the Mongol withdrawal, basically they didn't defeat the Mongols, but they caused the Mongols to withdraw back into Mongolia, believed that part of the problems that led to Mongol rule was the interaction with the rest of the world. And so they were eager to prevent much interaction with the rest of the world, prevent or at least keep it under tolerable limits. They didn't necessarily want large numbers of foreigners based in the capital city or other locations. And they provided greater power to the emperors to do just that, to limit the influence of foreigners. And they limited trade along the Silk Road as it had existed in the past. The result was some conflicts with some of the oases and towns that profited from the Silk Road's trade. Places like Turfan, which is a major outpost now in part of China, but in that era was ruled by Turkic population, a Muslim population, was involved in constant struggles with the Ming dynasty, in part because of trade and limitations and restrictions on trade. So the Ming felt that the real problem that China faced was too much interaction, too much involvement with foreigners, and they tried to curb that as much as possible.
So there's a Ming reaction against the multiculturalism of Kublai Khan that tries to, if not shut China off from the rest of the world, to limit interaction with foreigners. The way you were describing it, though, it reminded me of the 1793 mission of Macartney from the UK. I mean, obviously it's a different dynasty. This is several centuries later, but can we draw lines between that attitude that the Ming take in reacting to the Mongol Yuan dynasty and see it in this non-ethnically Chinese Qing dynasty, which
Yep.
has its own strange relationship to Chineseness?
Yes, I think the isolationism that was bred in the Qing dynasty had precedence, and the Mongols may have contributed to that because of they conquered China, and the reaction to that on the part of the Ming was to prevent as much as possible contact with foreigners and reasserting the idea that Chinese civilization was superior and that the only way that foreigners could come to China was to present tribute to the court, unlike the situation of the Mongols, where there was considerable interaction because of trade and support of trade by the Mongols. They welcomed foreigners by and large. Every kind of ethnic group can imagine from Asia reached China during the Mongol era, and even Europeans, Genoese, Venetians like Marco Polo. You don't have that as much in the Ming period.
The first diocese of the Catholic Church in Beijing was opened up during Kublai Khan's reign, right?
That's right. That's right.
The Bible, or the New Testament, I believe, was translated into Uyghur.
Yeah, yeah. That was a major development, and there were Catholics who reached China during that period. Even earlier, actually, the Pope sent a number of emissaries even before Kublai took power in the 1240s and again in the 1250s to work out some sort of rapprochement and agreement with the Mongols. So they were very well aware of Catholicism, and eventually a Catholic mission was established. Yeah.
We're talking a little bit about Europe now. You mentioned in your book that I think it's 1241 death of Ogadai it causes the Mongol expansion to stop. Do you think that had that not happened at that particular moment, Europe would have been conquered by the Mongols and it would have become kind of similar to Russia, ruled this territory that's previous
And
traditions are, yeah.
expanded into Western Europe. That's one thought, that instead of they defeated the Hungarians and the Poles, and so it seems odd that they wouldn't pursue their victories, particularly since Western Europe was fractured at that time. Conflicts among the various of the Western European political entities. There was no Italy. There was Genoa and Venice. There was no Germany, and Germany was disunited. And so it seems odd that they wouldn't pursue it. One explanation is that Ögedei's death in 1241, some of the Mongol nobility had to return to Mongolia to select a new great Khan. Another explanation that's been thrown around is by some geologists and environmentalists who claim that there was bad weather influenced the decision, that a kind of drought occurred in parts of the area where they were heading. If they went west, not enough pasture land for the horses, and the horses were vital if the Mongols were going to succeed. The Mongols were based upon their cavalry. Their successes were based upon cavalry. And so some speculation emphasizes that, particularly a number of people in the geology section at Columbia have been working on that subject. And so that's part of their thinking. I don't know enough about, the science to be able to judge that particular explanation. It may have some merit. I just don't know.
You mentioned horses. Mongols ride out of the steppe on horses. What innovations in horse riding did they bring that other people didn't have that allowed them to conquer such a large space? And how did that change when it hit the wetter part of China?
It's not just the horses. They had actually ponies. The horses were not as big as some of the Arabian horses of the Middle East. But one of the things they had was a bow and arrow that had a range much greater than any bow and arrow in the world. The deadly range of a bow and arrow was about 300 feet. The closest was the English longbow of about 150 feet. So they had a tremendous advantage
Wow,
in,
that's a huge difference.
yeah, it's a phenomenal difference. And plus, of course, they had unity for a time, which many of the steppe people did not have. They were fragmented and were unable to mount the kind of successful, unified attacks on some of these areas. Plus, these areas didn't exist as contemporary areas. There was no such thing as Russia. There was no such thing as Italy. And so they moved from one location to another and were successful in defeating discrete numbers of people. The students always ask me how they could have, with a population of less than 1 million, how they could have taken a Russia which had 10 million, a China which had 75 million. Um, and that's because these areas lacked unity and weren't, in large part, the Mongols were able to move against specific smallish groups in the population.
How long does that Mongol unity that you're talking about last? Because after by Kublai Khan's time, it does. Is it fair to say dissipate, or I don't know how do you describe that?
Yes, it faded because of the conflicts among them. Under Ögedei, Chinggis's son, up until 1241, was certainly the empire was unified pretty much, and that was the time when they had their greatest expansion. That's the time they moved into Russia, Hungary, Poland, and parts of the Middle East. And so they were fortunate in having that kind of unity that kept them going. By the time you get to Kublai in 1260, the empire has fragmented into four discrete parts. One part in East Asia, China and Korea, the second part in Central Asia, third part in southern Russia, and finally in the Middle East. So and in fact, there were conflicts among them. The group in Russia was at war with a group in Persia and the Middle East over territory. There were struggles between Central Asia and China starting around 1269, and that continued throughout Kublai's reign. So those led to weakness and undermined their ability to rule some of these areas efficiently.
I wanted to ask you also about sources, and I'm specifically interested in the secret history of the Mongols, which is sort of written in Chinese, like it's sort of in Chinese, but it has this very fascinating history.
Yeah, the secret history is one of the few sources we have about the early years of the Mongols. It includes some myths and legends, and so you have to dislodge some of that in order to get a valid picture of what happened. But it provides information about Genghis and about the early Mongols. It's in a curious blend of Chinese, very complicated, and therefore has been translated in an incredible number of times. It's one of the most translated works around because it's somewhat difficult. In terms of Kublai, you get a lot of Chinese sources about him, the dynastic histories of the Chinese, the private histories of individual Chinese scholars, and of course, one of the most important is Marco Polo. Uh, Marco visited during the time of Kublai's heyday and wrote a fabulous account of Kublai. It's a very personal account, much more so than the Chinese histories. The Chinese histories are somewhat portray Kublai as a stereotypical emperor and don't give you the kind of private life issues that would make Kublai stand out. Polo does to an extent.
How much do those Chinese sources talk about kind of ethnicity and Kublai's like Kublai being different from them, or is that not an issue for them?
They don't. The Chinese sources don't emphasize so much the distinctive ethnic identity of Kublai. You would think that he was a typical Chinese emperor if you read the histories, the Yuan dynasty, which he founded, the Yuan dynasty histories. There's very little about Mongol ethnicity and Mongol identity in the histories, particularly since they were written after the many of them were written after the Mongols had withdrawn. So it's difficult to get the Mongolian aspect of Kublai's personality and reign.
Why do you think they downplayed that? Was that just because they didn't want to acknowledge that China was being ruled by Mongols, or is there something? Is it
I think
just
in part Kublai didn't want to down didn't want to play up his ethnic differentiation from most of the Chinese, and he had considerable contact with Chinese counselors, Chinese advisors, and prized them. So he, in effect, took on the appearance of a Chinese emperor in many ways. And, the very fact that he was ruling in Beijing and not in the steppe lands was an indication or a signal to the Chinese that he was identifying more and more with Chinese civilization.
I once had a teacher in China who said that both Chinggis and Kublai were Chinese, and I was kind of puzzled by that because I mean, I thought of them both as clearly Mongol. I think the case can be made for Kublai to be understood both as a Mongol figure and this important Chinese figure. But my teacher was like, Kublai founded the Yuan dynasty, a dynasty of China, and his grandfather Genghis was important to him politically, and that's his grandfather. Therefore, he is Chinese. How do you talk
How
about
do
the
you balance
identity?
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that argument can't be used with Genghis. It's really, he did not identify with the Chinese, and he dealt with the Chinese. He conversations with a Taoist monk and so on, but he certainly was indigenously Mongolian and did not pretend to be in any way Chinese. And Kublai, was strategic in some ways. It may be that he still adhered to many of he did adhere to some of the Mongol traditions, putting up tents in the imperial palace compounds, and but he recognized that he had to appear to accept some aspects of Chinese civilization if he was going to rule successfully. And I don't think he identified with Hanness. That is, he did not identify exclusively with the Chinese. And I think he still had a strong connection to Mongolia and the Mongols. And it's certainly his choice of Tibetan Buddhism rather than Chinese Buddhism as the more important kind of Buddhism that the Mongols felt attracted to is maybe an indication of that.
You mentioned Marco Polo earlier. Marco Polo is this incredibly romanticized figure, but I had heard different things about how trustworthy his comments on China and the Yuan, his experience in the Yuan dynasty are. How much should we be believing Marco Polo?
Is a good friend of mine who wrote a study of Marco Polo. There was some question as to whether Marco Polo actually reached China, because he doesn't mention the Chinese language. He doesn't mention bound feet, which you'd think he'd mention. He doesn't mention a so-called Great Wall. But there's so many things that are accurate and that blend with what we know from the Chinese sources, from the Persian sources. My friend said that basically Marco would have had to have a PhD to be able to come up with that just without visiting China. I think he did visit China, and it's there is evidence about his leaving China. There are Persian and Chinese accounts that mention that a figure transported a Mongol princess from China all the way to Persia to be married to the Mongol ruler of Persia, and they both mention a particular European, and it's been identified as Marco Polo. There seems to be no question about that, and people just don't mention certain things. They don't necessarily mention everything. He dealt with the Mongols, not so much the Chinese. He doesn't. It's no accident that he wouldn't mention the Chinese language or bound feet. He dealt with Mongolian women who certainly did not have bound feet. And he does make a few grand gestures. He claims to have been a governor of a particular region, and that is impossible. The Chinese are very good record keepers, and we know the governors of that region, and there's no mention of Marco Polo. Then there's another big mistake. He mentions that he, his uncle, and his father were instrumental in a major Mongol victory over the southern Chinese, the southern Song dynasty. Well, that battle was important, but it occurred 3 years before he reached China. So it's a little exaggerated.
What is the name of his book and what is his name?
His name
Or
was Igor Derashvili,
okay.
a major scholar of the Mongols, who taught for many years at the Australian National University in Canberra. He wrote extensively and wrote a major work about, or a major refutation of the idea that Marco Polo didn't reach China. He definitely believed that Marco had reached China. and makes a strong case for it. He was a very distinguished Mongol scholar.
When I was doing my PhD, I had some professors chide me for using the word nationalism to talk about anything happening in China before really 1900. In your biography, you refer to proto nationalism. How much do you think it's fair to talk about nationalism pre-modern China? Lots of scholars, I think there's a kind of European orientation in a lot of nationalism scholarship where they're like, well, nationalism as we define it comes out of France and England, and then it
Yeah.
spreads to the rest of the world. But you can see a lot of elements of that same stuff going on in the Song dynasty and in the Mongols. I mean, the debate between Kublai and his younger brother. Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. It's not exclusively a European conception. I think there are elements of nationalism, as you say, in the Song and also among the Mongols in order to sustain themselves. They had to protect their identity and promote the idea of a Mongol nationality in order to survive in a basically a sea of Chinese. They were found right in a tiny minority among the Chinese, and so their attempt to protect themselves and attempt to survive as an independent unit led to assertions of national what we call nationalism.
One question I wanted to ask is more biographical about you. So you're one of the figures who helped revive Mongol studies or bring Mongol studies to the US. Before, scholarship in the US had really relied on Chinese sources that tended to play down the Mongols or not engage with Mongol language scholarship or repeat these, I'll say maybe xenophobic or racist depictions of the Mongols by the Chinese. And you also, if I'm correct, tell me if I'm wrong, you grew up or you were born in Alexandria, Egypt, and you fled
We didn't flee.
y'all didn't? Okay.
We left Egypt in 1950. My father had work in New York. We moved to New York. My other relatives were expelled in 1956 when the Israelis, the British, and the French attacked the Suez Canal under Nasser when Nasser tried to nationalize the canal. Those so we were fortunate in certain ways. My relatives were not uncles, aunts, and so on. Didn't have the same pleasant leave taking of Egypt, and despite that, many of them moved to U.S., Canada, France, various places. They still had good feelings about Egypt.
People say all scholarship is autobiographical. Does your role in bringing like a Mongol sense of Mongolness into U.S. scholarship, is it informed at all by that biography?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. My own life was shaped as a not necessarily as a refugee, but being leaving something that I really loved and had a strong association with in Egypt, and that made me aware of some of the identities that existed among the Mongols, the Chinese, and I think gave me somewhat of a perspective that I would not have had if I hadn't left Egypt in the way we did. So I think you're absolutely right. Autobiography does play a role in the kind of subjects that one chooses, and certainly I probably it would have been easier for me to focus on the Middle East as I knew the languages, but I gravitated towards East Asia in large part because I've found a simpatico aspect to it.
Did you use any of your Arabic language skills in drawing off of Arab sources, or were they all Persian source?
And
Or were
mostly Persians. There are some Arabic sources.
there are
Yeah.
okay.
And so I've been involved with particularly with the Arabic sources, and I did a little bit with the Persian sources as well. Of course, there are multi languages which mention the Mongols: Armenian, Georgian, Japanese. No one can know them all, and so it's kind of humbling to see that you can't do entirely the entire picture of the Mongol influence in in the world.
Professor Rossabi, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been awesome having you on.
It's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking about the Mongols to a general audience, which is great.
And the book is Kublai Khan, His Life and Times. It's been in print for so long, and it's one of the best sources on this pivotal global figure.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It was quite an experience. After I finished, I was sort of let down in a sense because it consumed me for some years.
Professor Rossabi, thanks so much again.
Take care.